He was the iron banker of America, the man whose handshake could steady markets, whose glare could unnerve presidents, whose fortune built industries and crushed rivals. John Pierpont Morgan, known simply as J.P. Morgan, was not just a financier, he was a force of nature. A titan who shaped American capitalism, rescued the U.S. economy more than once, and left behind a legacy of power so vast that it still echoes through Wall Street today. But behind the ruthless negotiator, behind the empire of steel, railroads, and capital, lived a man with a private world few ever saw. J.P. Morgan had 4 children, Louisa, Juliet, Anne, and J.P. Morgan Jr., who grew up not in the shadow of wealth, but in the shadow of a man who dominated industries and governments with the same intensity he brought to his family. Their childhood was one of privilege, yes, but also of distance, discipline, and expectations as towering as the man who raised them. Some followed his legacy. Others rebelled against it. All were shaped by the immense gravitational pull of a father who controlled the financial heartbeat of a nation. Tonight, we step past the caricature of the ruthless banker to explore the untold story, the family behind the empire, the children behind the banker, and the human cost of power measured not in dollars, but in legacy. Number 4. Louisa Pierpont Morgan Satterlee. Louisa Pierpont Morgan, born in 1866, was J.P. Morgan's first child, the daughter who entered the world at a time when her father was still rising, still sharpening the instincts that would later make him the most feared and influential banker in the United States. Her childhood unfolded between the drawing rooms of New York's elite and the growing empire of capital her father was constructing brick by brick. Yet Louisa's early years were far from warm or intimate. J.P. Morgan, even before becoming a titan, was emotionally distant, consumed by business, and defined by a stern, Victorian temperament. Louisa grew up in a household where gentleness was scarce and expectations were high. She inherited her mother's refinement and her father's formidable intelligence, giving her a quiet poise that would later define her adult life. As she matured, Louisa gravitated not toward finance or power, but toward culture, philanthropy, and historical preservation. She married Herbert Livingston Satterlee, a lawyer and naval historian who admired both her lineage and her intellect. This union allowed Louisa to step into a world where she could finally shape something of her own: social institutions, charitable foundations, and historical projects that preserved American heritage. But the relationship between Louisa and her father remained complicated. J.P. Morgan was a man who ruled industries with an iron will, and that same will often seeped into the private sphere. He expected obedience, precision, and respect, even from his own children. Louisa adored her father, but she also understood the cost of being the daughter of a man who viewed the world through the prism of control. Yet in her adulthood, she forged her own sphere of influence. Louisa became deeply involved in the Girl Scouts of America, serving as one of the organization's earliest leaders and advocates. She believed in empowering young women through education, discipline, and service, values she had learned indirectly from her father, though softened by her own compassion. Louisa also contributed significantly to the preservation of American colonial history, especially through her work at Sunnyside, Washington Irving's historic home, where she served as a guiding force for restoration and cultural programming. In a family dominated by finance, Louisa became the quiet cultural architect, the daughter who used privilege not to command, but to preserve, nurture, and educate. She lived her life in contrast to her father's ruthlessness, shaping a legacy grounded not in capital, but in community and culture. Louisa Pierpont Morgan Satterlee represents the gentler branch of the Morgan dynasty, the embodiment of refinement, intellect, and the desire to build a legacy not of steel and money, but of memory and meaning. Number 3. Juliet Pierpont Morgan. later Juliet Hamilton Meredith. Juliet Pierpont Morgan, born in 1870, entered the world at the height of America's Gilded Age, a time of breathtaking wealth, brutal inequality, and relentless ambition. She was J.P. Morgan's second daughter, and like her older sister Louisa, she grew up in a household governed by Victorian formality, strict expectations, and a father whose presence was as commanding as the industries he controlled. Juliet was delicate, introspective, and highly sensitive, qualities that clashed with the intimidating personality of her father. While J.P. Morgan demanded strength, discipline, and obedience from everyone around him, Juliet embodied a different spirit. She was artistic, emotional, and deeply affected by the pressures of being a Morgan in a world where society expected perfection. From an early age, she struggled with fragile health and inner turmoil. The chaos of the Morgan household, with its constant flow of diplomats, industrialists, and financiers, overwhelmed her. Where Louisa found her path in public service and preservation, Juliet retreated inward, searching for identity in a family where individuality was often sacrificed to legacy. Her father, though proud of her beauty and refinement, had difficulty understanding her. He was a man of order and logic, and Juliet was a woman of sensibility and feeling. Their relationship, while affectionate at times, was also marked by tension. J.P. Morgan wanted stability and strength in his children, while Juliet needed gentleness and emotional connection, things her father rarely offered. Juliet married William Pearson Hamilton, a prominent banker and businessman. The match was socially ideal, uniting two elite families of immense influence. But emotionally, it offered Juliet little refuge. Her marriage grew strained, and the pressures of high society only intensified her inner struggles. After years of unhappiness, she pursued a divorce, a scandalous, almost unthinkable act for a woman of her status in the early 1900s. Divorce freed Juliet from the constraints of a life that never fit her. She later married Pauline Meredith, a union that offered her emotional companionship and stability she had long sought. But the scars of her early life, the weight of being J.P. Morgan's daughter, the loneliness of societal expectation, and the battles with her emotional health, remained. In 1952, Juliet passed away quietly, far removed from the glare of finance and power that had defined her family. She left behind no empires, no corporate legacies, no institutions bearing her name, but she left a reminder that even in dynasties built on steel and money, there are hearts that break softly and stories shaped not by triumph, but by endurance. Juliet Pierpont Morgan represents the fragile side of the Morgan legacy, a life shaped by pressure, marked by struggle, and defined not by the empire her father built, but by the human cost of living so close to greatness. Number 2. TRACY Morgan. TRACY Morgan, born on July 25, 1873, was J.P. Morgan's third child, and the one who defied every expectation society placed upon wealthy women of her era. While her father built financial empires and dominated Wall Street, Anne built something far more radical, a life defined by service, independence, and international humanitarian work. She was the daughter who refused to be a silent ornament of Gilded Age society. Instead, she became one of the most influential women of the early 20th century. From a young age, Anne displayed a fierce intellect and an unshakable will. She admired her father's power, but refused to be confined by it. Unlike many heiresses of her generation, she did not seek luxury or frivolity. She sought purpose. She traveled widely, absorbed foreign cultures, and developed a deep sense of global responsibility, a mindset rare in the sheltered world of New York aristocracy. Her defining moment came during World War I. Rather than retreat to safety, Anne traveled directly into the war zone in France. She founded the American Fund for French Wounded and later the American Friends of France, organizing ambulance services, mobile hospitals, orphan support, and supply networks throughout devastated regions. She did not merely write checks. She worked on the ground, surrounded by rubble, poverty, and danger. Anne Morgan became the first American woman to receive the title Commander of the French Legion of Honor, a testament to her extraordinary courage and leadership. While her father controlled the world's finances, Anne fought to heal the world's wounds. After the war, she remained in France to help rebuild entire communities. She established schools, libraries, women's support networks, and agricultural programs. Her work transformed ruined villages into living, thriving towns, making her legacy not financial, but human. Anne never married. She chose instead a life of independence, philanthropy, and global activism. Her home in Près-sur-Marne became a center for relief efforts and international collaboration. Even into her later years, she remained an advocate for women's rights, workers' welfare, and global humanitarianism. In every sense, Anne Tracy Morgan was the moral counterweight to J.P. Morgan's empire. Where her father ruled with power, she offered compassion. Where he built industries, she rebuilt lives. Where he mastered wealth, she mastered service. She represents the Morgan legacy at its most noble, a reminder that even within families of immense privilege, there are those who dedicate everything to the world beyond themselves. Number 1. John Pierpont Morgan Jr., Jack. John Pierpont Morgan Jr., born on September 7, 1867, carried the greatest weight of all J.P. Morgan's children, the weight of inheritance. Known simply as Jack, he was the son destined not merely to bear the Morgan name, but to continue the Morgan empire, to uphold the dynasty his father had carved into the steel, rails, and capital of a nation. Where his sisters found space to cultivate identity apart from their father's world, Jack had no such freedom. From childhood, he was groomed meticulously for one purpose: to become the next J.P. Morgan. His tutors, travels, and education were all designed to sharpen him into a man capable of navigating the brutal world of high finance. Jack was quiet, disciplined, and observant, not as domineering as his father, not as theatrical, but with a calculating mind forged in the Morgan tradition. He learned banking not from textbooks, but from watching his father negotiate with presidents, break monopolies, and rescue the U.S. Treasury during financial crises. His childhood was less a childhood and more an apprenticeship. Upon his father's death in 1913, Jack became head of J.P. Morgan & Company, inheriting a position of immense global responsibility. But he took over in a different world, a world where public scrutiny was rising and the era of private bankers controlling national economies was ending. Unlike his father, who had worked almost as an unelected central banker, Jack had to operate under regulation, political pressure, and a rising populist distrust of concentrated wealth. Yet in the defining crisis of his era, World War I, Jack stepped fully into his inheritance. J.P. Morgan Jr. became the sole purchasing agent and financial conduit for the Allied powers, supplying billions of dollars of munitions, food, and supplies to Britain and France. Without Jack, the Allied war effort would likely have collapsed. His financing operations were so vast that he became a global force, the banker of the free world. But success brought danger. In 1915, a German sympathizer attempted to assassinate him, shooting him twice inside his home. Jack survived, but the attack exposed the level of hatred and risk attached to his position. Still, he continued funding the war with relentless focus, becoming a linchpin of international finance. After the war, Jack guided the Morgan Empire through the turbulent 1920s and the catastrophic crash of 1929. He testified in the famous Pecora hearings, facing a public eager to condemn Wall Street. He remained calm, reserved, controlled, a stark contrast to his father's thunderous presence. Privately, Jack was different from the titan he succeeded. He was a devoted husband to Jane Norton Grew and a caring father of 4. He valued modesty, art, and domestic peace in a way his father never had. He collected rare books, manuscripts, and artifacts, expanding the Morgan Library into one of the world's greatest cultural institutions. Jack's legacy is often overshadowed by his father's legendary power, but his impact was equally far-reaching. He guided the firm into the modern financial age, supported global stabilization efforts, and maintained the Morgan name as a symbol of stability during the most volatile era in American economic history. Where J.P. Morgan Sr. was the hammer, Jack Morgan was the anchor, steadfast, strategic, and quietly monumental. The legacy of J.P. Morgan and his 4 children is not simply the story of America's most powerful banker. It is the story of a family shaped by immense privilege, immense pressure, and the relentless expectations of a dynasty that helped build modern capitalism. Behind the thunderous presence of J.P. Morgan stood 4 very different lives, each reflecting a different facet of the world he created. Louisa Pierpont Morgan Satterlee, the eldest, transformed privilege into purpose. While her father built railroads and monopolies, she built cultural institutions, strengthened early women's organizations, and dedicated her life to public service. She became the Morgan grounded in community, the quiet architect of social good. Juliet Pierpont Morgan, sensitive and introspective, revealed the emotional cost of being born into a world ruled by power and perfection. Her struggles, her failed marriage, and her search for belonging underscore that even in the wealthiest families, pressure can become its own form of captivity. And TRACY Morgan, the bold humanitarian, rejected the velvet cage of the Gilded Age. She ventured into war zones, rebuilt shattered French villages, and earned international honors for courage. In a family defined by finance, she embodied moral greatness, the Morgan who chose service over empire. John Pierpont Morgan Jr., Jack, the heir, carried the full weight of his father's financial throne. He modernized the Morgan Empire, financed the Allied effort in World War I, and navigated the tumultuous shift from private banker-statesmen to regulated capitalists. Where his father ruled with force, Jack led with steadiness and pragmatism. Together, the 4 children of J.P. Morgan illustrate the human complexity behind a dynasty often reduced to numbers, power, and wealth. Their lives remind us that even in families of towering influence, identity is not inherited, it is forged. And at the center of it all stands J.P. Morgan himself, ruthless to his rivals, indispensable to his nation, and unknowable even to those closest to him. His legacy is written not only in financial structures and national institutions, but in the complicated paths his children carved in the long shadow of his empire. The Morgan dynasty did not end with steel or railroads. It continued through loyalty, resilience, rebellion, and service. Not just in boardrooms, but in hearts, histories, and human lives.